This week, returning to America's fascination with religion and diets led me to look at what the National Park Service's inventory of utopias might be. So this led me to the Amana colonies just west of both Iowa City and Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Unlike many religious utopias founded in the 19th century around the United States, this organization of true inspirationists that emigrated from Germany in the 1840s managed to reinvent itself several times and remains with its original ideas intact, but still flexible in the face of the world changing around it. Originally a truly communal colony of co-religionists, the Amana colonies expanded to 7 largely self-sufficient villages that mainly interacted with the rest of the world through selling handicrafts and foodstuffs based on skills and expertise also imported from Germany. Since life for all people depended heavily on communal support and included almost no cash payments through the mid-1800s, this way of life was not out of step with their neighbors. The care and pride in craftsmanship that was a cornerstone of their community made it so they had goods the rest of the world was interested in purchasing, things like watches, cloth, and even smoked meats. However, as the villages grew and the mechanical age encroached on the villages, coupled with the financial collapse of the country during the Great Depression of the 1920s, it threw the old methods of funding the communal life into disarray. Faced with the possibility of either dissolution or contraction and a turn to an even more austere way of life, the Amana colonies decided to give up their internal moneyless existence and went through what they called the Great Change. The entirely communal way of life was let go, though the principles of care, quality, and craftsmanship remain. Many things about this religiously founded utopia set it apart, but the main one seems to be its embrace of innovation. The most prominent example being the community promoting, owning, and producing the Amana line of appliances. Amana exists currently as a part of the Whirlpool Corporation, but began life as a beverage cooler company in the 1930s in response to the end of Prohibition. As you might guess, a community that had multiple beer brewing and winemaking facilities in each of the 7 villages had very little sympathy with the notion of outlawing all alcohol everywhere. The Amana Corporation would introduce the first side-by-side refrigerator freezers in 1949 and would make the first consumer models of microwaves in 1967, the Amana radar range. Over time, they would go on to supply the large American-sized clothes washers and dryers I appreciate after my 3 weeks away from them. And even though it is 2026, I would bet many of you, if you go check the garage fridge or freezer of an older relative, you might still find an Amana fridge out there. Before their acquisition by Whirlpool in 2006, Amana products were renowned for their longevity. I'm not saying they are exactly bad now, but they, like many other products, have succumbed to modern ideas about just how long a refrigerator should last. Oh, and instead of installing a surveillance system in the fridge, Amana introduced an option to have the surface of the fridge just be a dry erase board that was also magnetic. I got to admit, that's just kind of awesome. Anyway, many of the buildings in the Amana colonies are their original 19th century selves, though their internal arrangements, including electrical and plumbing systems, have been updated. But they are registered as National Historic Places, so you can go visit them, get bread from them, eat food grown there, and get not much interference from the internet. Oh yeah, and other than limiting the amount of prepackaged food from the outside world, the Amana colonies never dictated a particular diet. And coming from the dairy-heavy heritage of Germany, they were milk cleanliness sticklers. Boiling milk or fermenting it was extremely important in their food preparation practices. So if you'd like to check out a model on how to care for your community, hold on to principles, and yet live and grow with the present, consider a visit to the Amana colonies, a National Historic Place cared for, in part, by the National Park Service. Episode 180, America Goes on a Diet, Part 2. It's time to learn about cold cereal and how you probably don't chew your food enough, or maybe you do. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at the rise of cold cereal and why it is firmly a most American food. It is almost impossible to separate the move from farms into factories and cities from the adoption of cold cereal and all the technologies that make it possible. But to understand the rise of cold cereal, we need to see its beginnings. And to find them, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that the most popular cold cereal of the 20th century, Corn Flakes and the offshoots, is touted as the result of an accident. But it is truly a result of grudges, ambition, and most essentially, the new age of advertising, coupled with the peculiar brand of American exceptionalist religious fervor. If there's one thing that has become ever more common in the American mythos of success, it's the, quote, accident, or the, quote, insight, or seeing things different. And what is always left out are the effort, machinations, and sacrifices made along with the large financial gambles and often serial failures that many people do not make their way out of, and the personal connections and ruthlessness that often lead to infusions of cash at crucial moments. Along with the "I want to go fast" ethos that enters American food at the end of the 19th century, there's also an undeniable interaction between food, its necessity, and the American dream of making money. Back in the 17th and 18th century, the New World, here, was a place to grow and make foodstuffs that were profitable, versus the Old World, where most of the food made there was what you had to have to just live. It was sugar and coffee and tobacco and rice versus wheat and barley and local fruits and vegetables and the local fish and fowl. A mindset that making the food people ate every day could be a way to make a fortune instead of just a way to make a living was a new way to see food. And if you think about the quote-unquote old world food makers, the farmers, the butchers, the bakers, the jam makers, sure, the butcher was often portrayed as hefty and healthy looking, but none of these professions were touted as a way to make a fortune and maybe run for parliament or seek a knighthood or later run for whatever governmental political office was in the offing. But when colonial food growing became a thing, growing food did begin to become a way to get rich. Sugar magnates set policy. People ran off to America to grow tobacco in hopes of getting rich. And both pursuits used human beings as disposable machines. And as I was reminded while spending time in Ireland by the stone houses left to collapse, the absentee English farm owners of Ireland made money selling wheat flour and beef to factory workers in London and Sheffield while starving the Irish peasantry working their own farms in the 1840s. Anyway, all of this marked a shift in the way of thinking about food. Growing food or selling food was something you could do to make a fortune, rather than just a living. And that shift required thinking about food in a new way. Now, here in America, we were up to that challenge. We now had labeling. We were starting to incorporate mechanization into the processing of food, and we were building railroads, which also created a new way to deliver food. Into this new way of thinking about food, informing people about food, making food, and delivering food landscape, cold breakfast cereal was perfectly poised to be part of the new system. Even though cold breakfast cereal, eaten with cold milk or other liquids, first became popular at fancy, exclusive, expensive health spas in the American Northwest of that time, the cereals were speaking to a change that was present all over the growing country. For most of human existence, hot breakfast has always been a luxury. For that first meal of the day to be cooked or even warmed up, either you had to make it and have the kind of occupation that allowed you to do so, or you need to have someone employed to do it for you. Wives, kitchen servants, and boarding house owners all took on the job to differing extents, but all of them had to be up enough before everyone else to get the fire going and then do all the other work to produce something hot, Things like draw the water, brew the tea or coffee, acquire the eggs or grain products, not to mention any desired meat products, and so on. So this is why, for a long time, breakfast, for most people, was leftovers from supper or other foods, and sometimes hot and often cold, which is where the nursery rhyme peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold, peas porridge in the pot 9 days old has something to say. And also remember, hot cereal in the morning wasn't instant oats. It was closer to overnight oats. Stone ground oats for Scottish and English porridge or field corn for American grits requires at least a half an hour of cooking, and that's once you get the fire going. But cold cereal, it separated the effortful preparation, particularly the cooking part, in both time and space, from the eating of the meal. It also removed much of the flavor and pleasure of eating a hot breakfast from the meal. And at the time of its invention, that may have been more of the point. If you look back at episode 130, the first America Goes on a Diet episode, you get a more detailed look into the philosophy of one Sylvester Graham. But for our purposes, the most important thing to note is that he was an American religious evangelist worried about the human slide into folly through our attraction to things that brought out our animalistic side over our more human nature. Among several of the bodily pleasures he expressed fear of, and there were many, including that one, he saw the daily necessity of eating food as particularly pernicious. Because we must eat regularly, the opportunities to find pleasure in it are ever present. He was also worried that bathing at comfortable temperatures or sleeping on soft bedding could also lead to the degradation of our humanness through enjoyment. So it was only cold baths and hard beds as well. He recognized that seeing things like butter, cinnamon, congenial company, and comfy chairs while working to live this life of preventative deprivation could be stressful. So he also was a proponent of isolation and creating communities of people who shared your values. So in pursuit of creating a perfectly penitential life, he also created Graham flour. This was simply a coarse grind of wheat flour with both the germ, the oily part where the actual seed is, same as wheat flour, and he also kept in the bran, that last cellulose coating that protects the seeds from damage. The resulting gritty flour produced dense brown loaves of bread, and his disdain for salt and other seasonings meant that graham bread and graham crackers, the OG version, were quite tough and fairly flavorless. But in a world where so much seemed to be out of your control, wars, the railroads, the weather, political change, the idea that the choices of what you ate could solve all your problems really had appeal. Tying it to being in agreement with an appealing version of God also made it attractive. And so the end of the 1800s were a time when all manner of new American religions were taking off. And making paper cheaper didn't just make it easier to label food and advertise, the printing of books also took off, which meant lots more people suddenly took the opportunity to put their own ideas in print. If you look at the religious history of the United States, you will see an explosion of both Christian-oriented religions as well as a growth of spiritualist movements right around this time. Spiritualism often borrowed heavily from the Hindu pantheon, Buddhist practices, as well as the liberal mixing in of Greek, Egyptian, and Roman mythologies with the author's imagination. Societies and religious colonies and utopia sprang up all over the U.S. as new land for purchase and settlement was ever easier to reach through the advancement of the railway network. And because Graham and many others observed, we gotta eat, food restrictions and dietary instructions became a big part of many of these religious societies and communities. Now, many of the upstart religions would sputter out and fade, but others held a broader appeal, and one that still exists and sparked much of the religious healthism are the Seventh-day Adventists. Founded in 1863 and headquartered in Battle Creek, Michigan, it attracted a number of people feeling overwhelmed by this seemingly sudden increase in the pace of life. They had a point. If you used to live in a world that topped out at hand looms and horse speed, and found it now populated by steam trains, factory-made cloth, and paperback books, yeah, it could be a lot. And this was also an age when meat products were being provided from ever further away. The slaughterhouse and train shipments of refrigerated and canned meats was creating a food system of a complexity never seen before. So a mistrust of the food system was also growing. So in reaction to both a fear of the sliding standards of humanity and this mistrust in especially the meat industry, the Seventh-day Adventists, along with many other of these proliferating Protestant Christian offshoots, also promoted vegetarianism and a healthy digestion. It's also worth noting that this is the age when the study of anatomy was spreading, another thing refrigeration and the chemical age of the 19th century made more possible. So many people were learning about the organs and the processes of digestion for the first time as well. Anyway, the topic of vegetarianism and digestion were hot topics, and one aspect that particularly fascinated the staff at the Seventh-day Adventist Battle Creek Sanatorium, famous for launching the Kellogg's cereal line, as well as inspiring the products of one C.W. Post, they were fascinated with the topic of mastication, or, in regular words, chewing your food. Horace Fletcher was the figure that elevated extreme chewing of your food to its own obsession. Fletcherizing your food, or chewing it to a liquid state before swallowing it, was all the rage. So every bite of food was supposed to be chewed 100 times or so. Fletcher, as well as Graham, Kellogg, and others who were fans of the idea of thorough digestion, popularized the saying, "Nature will castigate those who don't masticate," as well as heavily promoting a low-protein diet. All in all, they saw that doing as much as you could by choosing your diet for gentleness and chewing your food as much as possible made it so the processes of digestion would not drain your vital vigor. By the by, our current trend of putting things in smoothies, that is, using a mechanical process to sort of chew it before it goes into our mouth, that kind of thing split the followers of Fletcher into two camps. Some thought steps to make food easier to ingest, for example, the steaming and rolling of oats so they're already partially broken down when you eat them, some saw that as helpful, but others felt steps to make it so you had to chew less robbed foods of some of their virtue. There was much fighting around this sort of divisive issue. Anyway, with people scattering and mixing around the expanding country, leaving their old communities and views of the world behind, it made for a population hungry for things to believe in that would make them feel safe. As a result, the burgeoning American population was fertile ground for this heady mix of new religions and dietary proclamations made possible by the new cheapness of paper, the rise of steam-powered printing presses, and the new railway network. But there was more going on than just religious societies and spas promoting the cold cereal lifestyle and people taking it home as sort of a souvenir. There were also changes to how people were living and where they found themselves waking up in the morning, hankering for some breakfast. These changes led to the adoption of the cold cereal way of life outside of the spa world. More people than ever were living outside of family structures, even just extended families. There was the mining camp, the logging camp, the railroad camp, ranching, cattle driving, fish camps, whaling camps, fur trapping, not to mention the growing fad of going on voyages of discovery, mapping, and exploration. In other words, suddenly, America had all these options to go out and try being on your own. Now, maybe not alone, but away from any sort of family infrastructure at all. And this also meant no kitchen, or only a rudimentary one. At the other end of the spectrum, more people were moving into more crowded quarters, but with only limited plumbing and cooking options. Many of the tenements, that is, the multi-story housing units new immigrants were finding themselves in, often shared a single privy and pump in a courtyard. And these buildings were so cheaply built that they had no fireplaces or chimneys as part of the indoor structure. Now, this meant all cooking had to be done out of doors, or all food had to be bought pre-cooked or in a state where only non-heat steps were needed for assembly. And layered on top of the trend of growing cities was the end of legal chattel slavery. You could no longer legally own a person to do your cooking for you. And so a whole bunch of people who used to be tasked with cooking other people's breakfast no longer were at that job. So all of these circumstances, plus the arrival of milk and ice delivery, stay tuned for more details, meant that we as a country were ready for the arrival of instant cold cereals. The last half of the 19th century and the few years leading up to the First World War in the 20th see a proliferation of cold cereals, ready right out of the box. Well, more or less ready. The first cold cereal was Granula, and it was for sale in 1863, but it was so hard it required an overnight soaking in milk or whey or water to be edible. And for more information on this first real for-sale cereal, see my new Substack. There's a link in the show notes. This bland, unsuccessful entry is followed rapidly by Kellogg's Wheat Flakes, or Granos, Corn Flakes, and a slow-baked granola bar thing. These were not marketed particularly beyond former patients of the Battle Creek Sanatorium. Fun fact, Kellogg also wanted to use the name Granula as well. I guess he liked the sound of it, and it suggested like grain and granules. But James Caleb Jackson, the originator of Granula and competing health spa owner in Dansville, New York, sued him. So Kellogg changed the name to Granola and also produced a grain-based coffee replacement as well as a wheat, gluten, and peanut-based meat substitute, available by mail order. Anyway, one former patient and later kitchen employee at the Battle Creek Sanatorium facility, a Charles William Post, did see this growing desire for faster morning breakfast coupled with the healthism and began marketing a number of sanatorium-related products to a wider audience. Post's marketing efforts debuted with Postum, also a toasted grain coffee replacement, which appeared in 1895. Postum survives to this day. It briefly died out after cereal sales, and acquisitions of the Post brand, and when Kraft acquired Post brands from General Foods in 2007, they dropped the Postum product, but it was revived by fans as a small brand in 2012 out of North Carolina, and you can still purchase it. The second product Post produced, and this was truly a cold cereal, was Grape Nuts, and it arrived on the scene in 1897. Now, quick thing here. Many of us, including me, have had this cereal, and it clearly contains neither grapes nor nuts. So what's up with the name? Well, in the early days of descriptive chemistry, there was very little food chemistry, and what there was often rotated around the production of alcoholic beverages. Now, when you're converting grains from starches into sugars that yeast can eat, they tend to mostly produce maltose, named after the malting procedure. This was later discovered to be a disaccharide made of two connected glucoses. On the other hand, many fruits produce quite a bit of fructose, again, named after the source, but fructose is already a single ring, a monosaccharide, but it is often found hooked to glucose to form the disaccharide sucrose, much of what we think of as table sugar. Anyway, in those early days, maltose was known as barley sugar, sugarcane was sucrose, and grape juice, when concentrated, will actually form crystals of a form of glucose. It's right-handy rather than left-handy, and it's known as dextrose, but that's extra. Anyway, at the time, this form of glucose that could just be separated out from concentrated grape juice was called grape sugar. Now, Post believed that the sweet taste he was getting from his processes of toasting malted barley that's in the recipe for grape nuts converted the maltose into glucose or grape sugar. And of course, the nuttiness and crushed nut crunchiness of the toasty nuggets explains the rest of the grape nuts name. I know this is a very twisty explanation, but these healthism guys of the late 19th century were really into this chemistry thing. Now, Post also introduced Elijah's Manna as a cornflake competitor in 1904, but changed the name to Post Toasties, as many people saw the biblical reference was a terrible thing to use as a way to sell things to make money. But watching Post rack up $3 million in sales from 1895 to 1900, and that's $3 million in 1900's money, which means it's like $120 million today, the Kellogg's people decided it was time to get serious in the cereal business. And the work to make Kellogg's cereal into a popular brand was mostly the work of Will Keith Kellogg, brother to the head of the sanatorium, John Harvey Kellogg. And it was the cereal business that would be behind what caused the family break and caused the two brothers to stop speaking for decades, all the way through their deaths. And it mainly rotated around WK's insistence that they should add a little sugar to the cornflakes so people who were not in the spa would also eat them. Now, it wasn't just Post and Kellogg getting into this quicker cereal business. Rolled oats would be created in 1877 by the brand new Quaker Company. Oat groats or grains were steamed and rolled flat to create a cereal that cooked more quickly and could be used more easily in baking and could even be eaten cold. Now, the use of oats for people food was more or less an innovation in the U.S. The end of the 19th century saw the first reduction in the use of oats as horse food, and the Quaker Company saw this as an opportunity to redirect the excess oats, and debuting a national cereal ad campaign in 1882. Because after all, you could sell oats to people for a higher price than you could as horse food. Now, it is true that by 1900 or even 1914, there weren't that many cold cereal brands, and they certainly weren't the majority food eaten at breakfast. There just wasn't that much instant cereal out there compared to the number of American breakfast eaters. Plenty of people lived in places where someone did get up and cook breakfast, a home, a boarding house, and many of those camps out there chopping down trees or cutting railway bed did have a camp cook to make you bad coffee, grits, and bacon. And cold cereal didn't take over in the cities right away either. There was always the neighborhood bakery, street cart sellers, and the incredibly common handful of bread and cheese or whatever from last night's dinner, as always. But cold cereals definitely caught on in the United States in a way they never yet have in the rest of the world. It's true that muesli, a version of granola that relies heavily on untoasted rolled oats, nuts, and dried fruit, was invented as a Swiss hospital food, but it started life more as an oatmeal substitute soaked overnight. And it was never really meant to be crunchy and sweet like American cereals. While the atmosphere was wide open for the wild idea of cold cereals, there was one other component that had to happen at the same time to keep the momentum going and bring cold cereal to the masses. That's right, we had to get a cold bottle of milk into every home. So next week, we will look at all the things that had to happen at the same time to make it possible for Americans to begin to expect that they could have a cold bottle of milk at home. Thanks for listening. And yep, there are a few new things. Yes, I have finally started putting out recipes that will go along with my episodes on Substack. And just as I figured out what this show was going to be as I went along, that'll probably be the same thing there. The link is in the show notes, but look for me as @THOA Food or The History of American Food when you are over on Substack. And for everyone who wonders how we, the United States, got this way about food, point them this way so you can discuss that fact with your friends. Any email questions or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. And as always, I love hearing what you have to say in your reviews. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads, Blue Sky, Insta, and now Substack as @THOA Food. And all this information is available in the show description.